All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of content to cover today, and we're so excited. My name is Rachel Reese. I'm CFLeads Communications and Digital Marketing Manager. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the third and final webinar in our series with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have great partners on with us today and amazing community foundations. So we're just so excited for you all to be here. And so I'm just going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. So because this is a webinar format, you can hear and see us, but we can't hear or see you. We will have a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to post any of your questions in the Q&A box and any other comments you may have in the chat box. If there are any technical issues, you can join us by phone. You can take a quick screenshot if you'd like. We have the webinar ID and the phone number right there. And then lastly, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be available on our website right there and our YouTube channel. And now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Mary Thomas, CFLeads' President and CEO.
Thank you, Rachel. And let me begin by just saying good afternoon, good morning to those of you who are joining us today. We're excited to be partnering with the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. I am Mary Thomas, President and CEO of CFLeads. Today, we have a strong program that we'll be bringing to you, and we'll be featuring Solomon Green, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy Development and the Office of Policy Development and Research. We'll have presenters who will do the overview of Funders Together to End Homelessness and Funders for Housing and Opportunity. Amanda Underi, CEO for Funders Together to End Homelessness, and Jean Fakata-Salisi, Executive Director, Funders for Housing and Opportunity. We'll hear some perspectives from community foundations. Jennifer Aldney, Senior Community Investment Officer for Partnership to End Homelessness, Greater Washington Community Foundation, and Charla Schaefer, the President of the Community Foundation of Greater Muscatine. And then, of course, we'll have some opportunities for questions and answers, group discussions with CFLeads, HUD, and foundations that will be moderated by our own Vice President of Learning and Impact at CFLeads, Lynn Bartell. So again, we're excited to bring to you this program today. But before I turn it over to Solomon Green, I want to just share just a little bit about CFLeads. CFLeads is the country's national network of community foundations committed to community leadership. And I've had the privilege of leading this organization now for just over a year with an incredible team. We get up each morning really working to advance the practice of community leadership and strengthen the community leadership muscle of community foundations, sharing field innovations and taking on some of the most critical issues of our time. And today, housing happens to be one of those issues. Our mission is to help community foundations build strong communities, yes, in their place-based communities by advancing effective practices, sharing knowledge, and galvanizing action on critical issues of our time. That's who we are, that's why we exist, and that is what we're passionate about each and every day. The objective of this collaboration with HUD is to share and learn more about each other's work in addressing affordable housing and homelessness. And from the community foundation perspective, we've learned from this series that community foundations are engaged in this topic and they are well positioned to be community conveners. And I certainly can attest to that, having served in a community foundation for 25 years. And I understand and know fully the power of community foundations as conveners on issues such as housing and other areas. As we've seen from the incredible community foundations, both small and large, featured in the last two webinars and the ones you will hear from today, many different approaches exist to address affordable housing and homelessness. And we have so much to learn from each other. Housing is also an integral part of economic mobility, and CFLeads is committed to providing learning opportunities and programming for the most critical issues of our time, such as economic mobility. If you're interested in becoming more engaged with CFLeads, we just launched the second iteration of our Economic Mobility Action Network. And we've been holding convenings around the country, and our next Economic Mobility Regional convening will take place in July in Kansas. We hope that you'll join us there. And as a reminder, the webinar series is recorded and is available on the CFLeads website and our YouTube channel. Additionally, CFLeads will be sharing a compilation of resources and tools summarizing the practices mentioned throughout the series. And in closing, I'd invite you to stay connected with us by visiting our website, www.cfleads.org. Find us on LinkedIn and Facebook. You'll also find that we're growing, so we invite you to consider joining CFLeads. There are 2 opportunities now that are posted, and also consider being an investor. Thank you for being with us today, and now I will turn it over to Solomon.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. Good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining today's webinar. As Mary mentioned, my name is Solomon Green, and I serve as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. This means I lead a team of over 200 researchers, policy experts, innovators, and capacity builders in the office we refer to as PD&R at HUD. I want to start with a huge thank you to the CFLeads team, including Mary, Len, Leonard, Rachel, and Danka for co-hosting this webinar series with HUD. I also want to thank Mia Bailey from PD&R's International and Philanthropic Affairs Division, who has been working closely with CFLeads to organize the series and share information with you all. As Mary mentioned, the purpose of this 3-part joint webinar series is to share and learn more about each other's work in addressing affordable housing, to strengthen communication and coordination between HUD and community foundations, and to garner more support from and better align efforts with community foundations in addressing their local housing needs. Though today's webinar marks the end of this series, I hope it serves as a beginning for many of you as you consider concrete ways your foundation can expand access to affordable housing and work to end homelessness in your community. HUD's relationship with CFLeads and commitment to partnering with community foundations and other philanthropies to address our country's affordable housing crisis continues beyond this webinar series. At HUD, we have a dedicated office tasked with establishing and nurturing these types of partnerships with philanthropies and international housing officials to ensure that our efforts are sustainable and last beyond one-off meetings or webinars. This office is called the International and Philanthropic Affairs Division, also known as IPAD, and it includes Mia and other experts with a strong background in philanthropy. I encourage you to stay in touch with HUD through IPAD as we continue to identify ways we can work together. Now, when we kicked off this series back in January 2024, you heard from my colleague, Brian McCabe, who serves as HUD's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development. During his remarks, Brian outlined the mission and structure of HUD, sharing that our mission is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all. He also noted that HUD is organized into 10 regions, with field offices located throughout each region. Our regional and field offices are also a great resource for you as we continue this work together. They are each led by a regional administrator, who is typically a political appointee, and field office directors, who are career staff. I'll drop contact information for each field office in the chat, so you know how to stay in touch with your local HUD leaders. Brian also provided an overview of our flagship programs at HUD, including the Office of Policy Development and Research, which I'm fortunate to lead, the Office of Housing, which includes the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, the Office of Community Planning and Development, our Office of Public and Indian Housing, our Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and the Office of Field Policy and Management, which oversees those regional and field offices. He also noted that they are all working in unique ways to tackle the housing crisis we face through historic levels of funding made possible by the Biden-Harris administration. Then in March, you heard from Kira Package, the Chief of Staff in our Office of Community Planning and Development. Kira talked about the ways in which HUD is working to address the housing shortage in the US, highlighting aspects of the 2022 Housing Supply Action Plan and capturing ways in which HUD is working towards the goal of providing affordable quality homes for all through both production and preservation. Armed with that information that we shared with you in those previous two webinars, we, along with CFLeads, thought it would be useful to reserve this last webinar for you to hear from the experienced philanthropic leaders who are strengthening communities through their investments and are knowledgeable about ways to partner with government entities like HUD and other philanthropies to address the affordable housing crisis. So at this time, I'd like to invite Amanda Ndiri, Chief Executive Officer of Funders Together to End Homelessness, and Jeannie Fakata-Selassie, Executive Director of Funders for Housing and Opportunity, to share ways in which their organizations are mobilizing philanthropy across the country to address these critical issues and to offer concrete ways you can join in this fight for housing for all. Thank you. Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
I think I'm gonna hop first and then we'll let Amanda go next.
By all means.
Thank you. I'm Jeannie Fakata-Selassie. I use she, her pronouns. And Solomon said, I'm the Director of Funders for Housing and Opportunity. We are a cross-sector, nonpartisan, nationwide funder collaborative, and we're committed to improving housing options and life opportunities, especially for those who've been systemically discriminated against by our nation's racist housing policies and practices. So our vision really is that renters have access to safe, stable homes they can afford in communities that support better health and economic mobility, access to good jobs and schools, free from the barriers and harms of systemic racism. We have 13 member organizations who are members, and they are diverse and engaged. They include funders with a range of focus areas and geographies and different sizes. But we are primarily a grant-making body, which means our members pool their funds to make grants in 3 areas that we believe really work together to bring about systems-level change. And at the end of this call, after we hear from the community foundations, we'll talk more about what those funding priorities are a little bit later, and some of those tangible ways that philanthropy, government philanthropy and government can engage. We'll save those tangible things for the very end. But the other thing we do is, because we are grant makers, we also are learning alongside our grantee partners. And so as a funder collaborative, we have a point of view about what things work, and hopefully we can use that point of view to have an influence and a greater impact on recreating a housing system that's just and fair and built on values of equity, inclusion, and shared prosperity. Because we know that any one foundation on its own can achieve good, but together we can learn from each other and perhaps do more. So in addition to our grant making, we support our members and the broader field to prioritize housing justice and advance the evolution of grant making toward racial justice. And Amanda will share a bit now about Funders Together to End Homelessness and how they and we see kind of what housing justice means for us in philanthropy. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda now.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. Hi, everyone. Amanda Ndiri, she, her pronouns. I'm the CEO of Funders Together to End Homelessness. Our work focuses on, as well as housing justice, although we consider ourselves a network of philanthropy with over 300 members from across the country that also represent a diversity of types and models of philanthropy, from traditional family foundations, United Ways, corporate philanthropy, and emerging organizations who don't necessarily fit into one of those, but still do their primary function is grant making. Like Funders for Housing and Opportunity, we do focus on housing for all people. And when we say all people, we think about it from a standpoint of having abundant housing for all people with a focus on housing justice, which I'll get into in a second. So for Funders Together to End Homelessness, again, we are a philanthropy mobilizing organization. Like our colleagues at CFLeads, who are in the broader community of philanthropy serving organizations, we consider ourselves a network that doesn't do grant making, but we like to say mobilizing philanthropy instead of serving philanthropy because we have such a strong focus on advocacy and policy. We bring our members together to learn, connect, and act around housing justice and support our members' grant-making strategy to achieve housing justice as racial justice to not only prevent and end homelessness, but think about what rich abundance housing could be for all people. Our primary work focuses on supporting our members' learning journey towards housing justice, supporting their grant-making strategy, bringing our members together to convene to learn from each other, either one-on-one in small groups in communities of practice, or at two of our in-person national convenings and many, many online convenings that we host in terms of programming and learning and discussion. 2 years ago, we set out on a path to update our strategic plan from our commitment to racial equity to learn from community about what it would look like to center housing justice as the way to prevent and end homelessness, and also prevent and end housing insecurity for those who are most marginalized by systems of oppression. So I'm going to just briefly share with you our definition of housing justice that we have been circulating for a while, and I'll also put a link in the chat, and I know that CFLeads will be sharing these resources after the webinar. So when we think about housing justice, we unapologetically say that housing is a fundamental human right. We also know that housing justice is a building block for racial justice and liberation. We know that a just housing society has to be rooted in safe, secure, accessible, affordable, and dignified living conditions where people can have agency and power over where and how they live. And that is the key for us in housing justice and how it might be different from the work that we've seen even in affordable housing and ending homelessness, all really important steps. And for us, even racial equity, we think is a step and a pathway to achieve housing justice as racial justice. All really important things, but for us, housing justice clearly says that our housing systems have experienced marginalization, oppression, and are rooted in racist policies. But there's an opportunity if we think about what does it mean to repair, to hold people accountable, including ourselves as philanthropy, as well as our government partners and people who lead in community. But I always go back to the agency, power, and choice. When I did a lot of direct service work just outside of DC, ran a couple direct service organizations, we did good work. But the thing that still keeps me up at night is that we moved people farther and farther away from their community in order to move them into affordable housing. And that meant that they didn't have a lot of choice. It meant sometimes that they were further away from jobs, from transportation, from the person that helped their kid get to daycare, or the person that helped them to commute to their job. And we see this more and more in communities, the false choices that we give people, that we don't let them define what community means for them, and that they don't have a lot of agency, power, and choice in where and how they live and how they get to define community. So I'm hoping today in our discussion, we not only consider this definition as a way to disrupt our thinking about what affordable housing is or could be, but also we'll hear some great examples of how community foundations have been thinking about housing justice, racial justice, and racial equity. So I am very, very pleased to introduce the two people who will be speaking to share some examples. First is Jennifer Olney. She is the Senior Community Investment Officer at the Partnership to End Homelessness at the Greater Washington Community Foundation. Full disclosure, I serve as one of a member on the Leadership Council of that partnership. And Jennifer's also a former staff member at Funders Together to End Homelessness. But we're so pleased to welcome her. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Amanda. So as Amanda said, I work at the Greater Washington Community Foundation, which, if you're not familiar, is the DC Community Foundation, DC and the surrounding counties in Maryland and Virginia, and work specifically on our Partnership to End Homelessness, which is an initiative of the Community Foundation and a partnership with DC government, the DC Interagency Council on Homelessness. So before I get into a little bit more about the partnership, I think it's helpful to talk a little bit about how we got here. The Community Foundation, as I'm sure many of you, has been investing in housing for a very long time. Before the early 2000s, it was really under our safety net programming, and we're doing our investments more one-off and more in direct services. In the early 2000s, the Community Foundation came together with a few other foundations in the region and in the city to fund a position in the DC government that would coordinate, the idea being to coordinate all of the work happening at DC government agencies related to housing and homelessness. And this became the DC Interagency Council on Homelessness. So if you're familiar with the US Interagency Council on Homelessness, it's kind of a similar model. So we funded that position again in the early 2000s, and then in 2014 funded a housing security study that really raised kind of the gaps and the need for more affordable housing in the region, and specifically in DC, and some opportunities for philanthropy to be a part of the solution and to invest in affordable housing and ending homelessness. And after that study came out and several conversations that followed on that, in 2018, the Community Foundation came together with the DC Interagency Council on Homelessness. The head of that was now being funded by DC government. So it was originally funded by philanthropy and then taken over by DC government. And there was a recognition that while the DC Interagency Council on Homelessness was coordinating the nonprofit providers, DC agencies, people with lived experience, and advocates, that there was a lack of coordination in the private sector. So the Community Foundation said, recognizing that we have this role as conveners and have unique relationships with stakeholders across the private sector, that we would coordinate individual donors, philanthropic entities, and corporate representatives in partnership with the ICH and with the goal of aligning private sector resources with the city's plan to end homelessness. So we launched the partnership in 2019, recognizing that philanthropy had a critical role to play when it comes to extremely low-income housing, that we could make smaller investments to leverage much larger public sector resources, that we were conveners and could play a role in education and convening, and that we had a really important role to play in advocacy in the private sector more broadly as well. And we committed to doing all of that with a focus on racial equity and centering the leadership of people with lived experience in the community. We had 4 goals when we launched, and to this day, those were to increase the supply of deeply affordable housing, to help people exit homelessness as quickly as possible, to strengthen the homeless service and homeless response system, and to build public will for ending homelessness, which we said included changing perceptions about homelessness and affordable housing in DC, and creating private sector champions for this work. So, for a long time, the Community Foundation had been involved in this space, but we were hearing from our community partners, from nonprofits, from donors, and the community at large that housing was really one of the, if not the most pressing issue that was facing our communities, and that we had a bigger role to play. And the partnership was really how we stepped into that space specific to DC. Again, the Community Foundation is regional, but this effort is just specifically focused on DC because it's a partnership with DC government. So I know every community foundation is different. The Greater Washington Community Foundation does not have a large endowment, so we're really fundraising for all of these programs and initiatives and all of the work that we wanted to do through the partnership to end homelessness. We've been doing this since 2019, so going on 5 years, and we've raised and granted about $3.5 million, and we have mobilized just over $15 million through our impact investments. So our grant-making fund focuses on pilots and innovation, and then about half of our grant-making goes to advocacy and organizing efforts. And then our impact investing is an option that we offer to our donor-advised fund holders, and that the Community Foundation has invested in as well, focused on deeply affordable housing. So over the past 5 years, we've learned a lot. We also launched in 2019, and then we all know what happened in 2020. So a lot changed since we launched. But I think a few of the things that we've learned, first and foremost, that education has been critical to everything that we wanted to do. A large portion of our activities have been on focused on education in various forms, for our Private Sector Leadership Council that Amanda mentioned, which is made up of private sector leaders from across the city and across different sectors. We have provided education opportunities for our individual donors and other people around the community foundation tables, and also for our foundation or philanthropic partners that are focused on this work. And we've really focused on education opportunities, not just around solutions like permanent supportive housing and the need for more deeply affordable housing, but also focused our educating our partners on why we have committed to a focus on racial equity and why we're committed to following the lead and the leadership of people with lived experience. And I think that has been really critical, especially as we've asked our partners to join us in investing in systems change and not just direct services, but also asked our partners to join us in advocacy efforts, which has been a really big part of our work. We've also learned a lot about these partnerships that we've had to build, and from these partnerships that we've had to build to do this work. Partnering with our local government partners has been both a beneficial and has offered credibility to the work that we're doing, but it's also, we've come across challenges, especially as it relates to the fact that we are very involved in advocacy. So the benefit being that we are deeply involved in the day-to-day conversations at the interagency council table and the work groups that are a part of that. So we have a better sense of kind of the systems work that is happening. And we also, again, have credibility when we're going out and fundraising. A lot of our partners love to see that we're working so closely with our government partners. However, we have learned along the way that we need to broaden our partnerships to beyond just the Interagency Council on Homelessness and that team, which has been our key partner in this work, and really need to build our own relationships with other DC agencies. And we needed to be more explicit from the start. So looking back, if we were to do this again, we needed to be more explicit at the start as to how we were going to make decisions when it came to advocacy, and what our priorities would be. And we've had to kind of go back and do that. And really where we've landed and what it's come down to is that our commitment is to supporting efforts that are led by people with our partners with lived experience, in areas where we think that our voice and our influence can really have an impact. When it comes to partnering with other foundations, this is actually an area where we've been more successful, I think, and learned a lot. But what we've seen is that foundations who have staff that are dedicated to housing or homelessness are really excited to be more deeply involved in these systems conversations, again, beyond the direct service investments that they've been making, most of them, and really starting to look at systems change. And the foundations that do not have staff people are happy to have an avenue either to invest with us through the partnership to end homelessness or to make their own grants, but with the alignment with the work that we're doing and with the bigger picture. And finally, partnering with the private sector. So really thinking more about corporations, which was a goal of the partnership, has been harder than we thought it might be. We have effectively leveraged some of the private sector power for budget advocacy, recognizing that more money for these priorities is good for everyone. But because we are so focused on systems change, we have struggled a little bit to fundraise for some of this work because there's not always a physical product to see or something to put your name on. And that has been something that we are still working on. I'd say there are a few things we've learned that I think are things that we've done that are specifically beneficial because we're a community foundation. And those are the ability for community foundations to advocate and lobby has been really important. And we've really leaned into that and are hoping to do even more of that and expand that work. But it's an area where we've been told by our partners we have had an influence and an impact, and where we're really needed and need to step up even more. We also know that community foundations are uniquely situated to be conveners. And so we've been able to bring together our partners with lived experience, our donors, the other foundations around the table, and the nonprofits to really come together and to hear from one another and to build those relationships, really amplifying the voices of folks with lived experience in our education series, but also in our advocacy efforts. So I will pause there maybe. Again, we're about 5 years in, and really I think what we've learned is that we have a really important role to play, and we have elevated the advocacy and organizing capacity in DC, specifically efforts led by people with lived experience, and that our donors and funding partners are more educated on these issues and kind of ready to be a part of the solution. So I'll pause there, turn it back to you, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And we will now hear from Charlotte Schaefer, who is the CEO of the Community Foundation of Muscatine.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you, Amanda. So I'm an old banker, and I was blessed to work at the homeless shelter before arriving at the Community Foundation of Greater Muscatine, which is in Iowa, nearly 6 years ago. And just to give you an idea, Muscatine's a rural community. We have a county size of 45,000. Our foundation's about $60 million, 35% endowed. We're not very well endowed, and we have very, very little unrestricted funds. So we have to be really creative when it comes to our strategic initiatives. Our team's a team of 10. We have 1.5 positions that are specifically directed to our housing work. And that's where I'm going to recap our story in a moment. But first, I often ask, what's the single biggest threat to a child's well-being? And I know many of you, our parents, are probably thinking their siblings, but we know, in fact, that it's poverty. And that's impacted by the supply side failure of housing. It makes rents out of reach. This creates that cascading impact to the education and health of our neighbors and children. You know, we have a rising food insecurity, but few are asking why. And we know pre-COVID in our community, children on free lunches were changing schools 3 to 4 times more often within our district in a given year versus a child on a regular lunch plan. And it was due to primarily housing instability. According to the University of Minnesota study, we know 20% gap for graduation rates between stably housed and stably housed and free and reduced. And it's a 20% again reduction when you look at unstably housed children. It's astounding the impact it has. And we know the leading cause of homelessness in Iowa is affordable housing, as we see across the nation, and that's at 80% is affordable housing issues. So as a community foundation, when we look at these stats, we know it's clear that equitable housing, education, and health access efforts are a leveling mechanism for our children, and we have to be ruggedly impatient in our work. So that kind of opens up our collaborative housing work. And I think to tell a story, we really have to go back and look at our board evolution, because that's where it started. When I began in 2018, we had a few board members that would say things that were just categorically wrong when they were talking about community issues. So the first thing we had to do is go, as board openings happen, is stack it with topic experts on housing and education and health and racial justice to cut down on this misinformation and let us start making better decisions. At a board meeting around that time, the board was all feeling pretty good about themselves that day because we were funding food backpacks for hungry kids for the weekends. And our team stopped and said, if we give the same hungry kid a food backpack in kindergarten as we do 12th grade and don't try to change their circumstances, shame on us. And that was really our start. We then determined our primary tenet was to collaboratively address the community's biggest challenges with upstream thinking. So often we've been serving downstream as community foundations and downstream outcomes rather than preventing them. So it's like we continually choose to, if we have a house, we continually choose to replace the drapes when we have a hole in the roof. And the hole in the roof for our community is housing. And so we've got to get upstream. So that's where we made our shift. And we chose at that point to move from a passive downstream funder to a community catalyst and start really convening our partners and entering the work to fill the gaps. And we had housing and justice as our foundational focus in these decisions, as you'll kind of see as we work through. Now, when my children were 3 and 1, their names are Brad and Mark, we told them we were going to have a new baby. And so the following morning, Brad, the 3-year-old, came in his speedy pajamas into the kitchen to inquire, when does Mark leave? Because if somebody was coming, clearly somebody was going, it wasn't going to be him. But unfortunately, that's literally what we do in communities. When a group starts to work in a particular area, another group leaves. And it takes an entire posse. And so too often, when it comes to complex issues, we're trying to address their societal navigation, and that's just suboptimal for success. So this is our work to collaboratively leverage resources and expertise from a variety of partners. And to be clear, I think there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And that's the work that we're trying to do. So we think a critical component to our work is just to get our community to think differently. And we heard that in the earlier conversation. We have to speak to the heart and the mouth of the housing issue. The math is irrefutable. We have to talk a lot about the kids and economic development and essential workers. 25% of our teachers don't even live in our county. But we use in our communication kind of the bust open the pinata method to communicate. So no one, it's not one shot that busts the pinata, it's accumulation of all these hits. And that's what we do to try to get people to think differently and think upstream. But simultaneously, we took action. So to that end, I'm going to touch on the 9 quick examples of collaborative upstream housing work that we as a community foundation have been doing over the last 4 years. And the first thing that we did is 4 years ago, we collaboratively developed a countywide housing plan with the city and the county and local industry. And that was later adopted by the city and the county. Now, for some of the community foundations that may think that's going to cost a lot or take a lot, I literally used Canva for the first time over a couple, 3 weekends and put the plan together, working with our housing person that we work closely with at the city, and rolled that out. And that's what was adopted. So there wasn't cost other than time on that. But that's what we use as our anchoring mechanism and all the other work that we've done. We established a housing council from there, and that was the second thing we did of our collaborative partners to focus the conversation. Now, I could talk about what we do, but instead I'm going to tell you to go see what the Mountain Housing Council of Tahoe Truckee does, because they do it better than us, and it's also facilitated by a community foundation. So check out their work. From there, we began hosting annual housing summits, and we invited an array of community leaders across all different spectrums to understand the ROI of the housing annuity, as well as the related downstream outcomes to health, education, and GDP when there's a supply side failure. From there, we, in our state, we have prisoners in our penitentiary build homes, and then they ship them in one piece on a truck to your community. You can buy them. And so we brought one to our community, and we replaced a dilapidated home in a pretty difficult neighborhood and really improved it. And it gave us a microphone when a truck moves in with a full house on it through a community to also talk about our housing needs. But also, I want to just kind of call out what we're talking today. This program, the prisoners that work to build these homes, they're experiencing 30% less recidivism rate than any other trade training that they go through. So it's a pretty incredible model. From there, we opened a revolving loan fund, and we are administering that with a community group that oversees it, but we did that to fill gaps, or what I would call create an additional capital stacking mechanism for housing development, and we aimed at 80% LMI or below. The next thing, number 6, is we collaboratively established a community grant writer in our community. So we and the city and the county went together and funded a position. It sits at the community foundation, we oversee it, and it focuses on community priorities of housing, health, and education, and getting these intersecting issues, right? The first 18 months, we marshaled more than $8 million from outside the county to our community, to our rural community. And honestly, we had a 23-year-old grant writer, right, leading this direction, but it made a huge difference in some of the work we're doing as we start to stack cash around it. Number 7, we partnered with Iowa Economic Development Authority to do a collaborative neighborhood revitalization pilot project. And we picked the most difficult neighborhood we had. We're facilitating the project alongside the city, who serves as fiscal agent. 33% children in the neighborhood, 74% of the children are on free and reduced lunches, has the highest police calls for the city. Big portions of it are 79% landlord owned. And so we're trying to make a difference through infrastructure improvements, housing development, housing rehab, housing facade improvement, homeownership, community facade. And then the thing that we added to this whole thing is because was family stabilization, which we often don't think of when we think of neighborhood revitalization. But if we're going to pilot this, we really think that's an important component, again, connecting all the pieces for success. The number 8 is we built the first 3D home in the state of Iowa last year, and then we took it down. So the contractor didn't choose a crete mix that made it met our strength requirements, and we could have mitigated that, but it wouldn't have looked the way we intended, and we decided to be uncompromising as we begin some of this work trying to push the price down on house building. But us doing 3D house printing as a community foundation, as well as building with other alternative technologies, is an effort to create building models that decrease building costs, improve speed to market, provide extreme weather resistance, an important component, reduce utility and maintenance expenses, because again, those are the housing expenses that are hard to deal with, but while creating rural replicability. And that's the important component from our perspective. Developers often overlook counties of our size, although 68% of all counties in the US have populations of less than 50,000 like us. So our intent became to open source all of our findings to our building and arm our local entrepreneurs with this like horizontal information so that they could take that and then meet the needs of local housing, construction supplies, and materials, maybe in different price points than they've been able to do before. We're working closely with the community college to support their construction trade program through some on-site job internships with our building. And then the community college is actually going to pioneer building a 3D home printer. And they have been working with a college out of Arizona, and we plan to purchase that from them and begin hopefully building in the fall with that particular technology. But to give you an idea, our intent is to build 10 homes and do this modeling across various technologies, alternative technologies this year, and then we anticipate doing that or more in the future years and sharing that information openly. And the last thing I wanted to mention is we requested the University of Iowa perform a housing ROI study with us, and we've now expanded that to the University of Minnesota thanks to Ben Winchester. We know how housing is a powerful community accelerant, but until we tell that story in the right math, it's difficult sometimes to get the community to invest. So our central question we're posing is, as a community, would we be better off financially to invest in housing now, or forego the income stream created through housing, as well as cover the expected future costs of the adverse outcomes from families living in unaffordable housing? And that's really, we don't think of the system costs and the system outcomes for the families that are living unaffordable housing when we look at the investment structure. There is an unmistakable risk of inaction. So that's a little bit about what we're up to in our small rural community. I just want to thank all of you for everything you're doing in your community to make a difference in the lives of your neighbors and children. And I will turn it back at this point to Amanda and Jeannie.
Wow. Thank you both so much. You got so much in the time allotted, and we really appreciate it. I think we're going to be really quick because we want to get into questions and discussion. So what does it mean after this webinar series to get involved in housing affordability and housing justice, in thinking about housing for all with an explicit racial equity lens? I have just a couple of things that I would offer you to think about. Of course, there is an opportunity to join and learn from Funders Together. We are a learning network, and we help members learn individually in partnership with each other, and as I mentioned, through our programs and webinars. And particularly, have you set a path for learning about housing justice? The next thing is thinking about, does your community or state have a local network of funders that is thinking about housing justice and its intersection? At Funders Together, we like to say that everyone is a housing funder, as iterated by the examples given today, where housing impacts child welfare, education, environment, health, and many other things. So how are you creating an opportunity to not only convene grantee partners, but also convene other funders at different intersections to learn about how they can play a role in housing and housing justice? We often hear from a lot of funders that they lack expertise or maybe don't understand what they can do because they think that they have to put in the resources to build the housing, and often don't think about the role they can play in advocacy, policy, organizing, and activism to make sure that we have the most resources in the most just and equitable way to provide housing. And that doesn't have to come from their own grant-making dollars alone. It could come to support their grantee partners in doing that education and advocacy. It can come in establishing staff positions that are thinking about housing affordability and ending homelessness in their local and state offices. And it can come by pooling resources together, as we support many regional networks across the country and even a statewide network that's thinking about these things in terms of policy advocacy and pooling resources to support grantee partners. And then finally, as well as convening, a lot of our members are thinking about things like narrative change, and we have a whole resource around narrative change that I'll share with you. They are thinking about ways to support lived experience and lived expertise, a vital role if we're going to be talking about equity and justice, and many foundations can play a role in making sure that people with lived experience are not only paid and resourced, but are prepared to participate in these important discussions. And how are you growing on your racial equity and justice journey to learn about how housing impacts all of those things? So I'll turn it over to my colleague Jeannie for ways that she thinks that you can take next steps.
Thanks, Amanda. You can tell Funders Together and FHO are close partners because Amanda said most of what I would have said, but much more eloquently. I would say Amanda talked a lot about beyond the check, ways to support housing justice. But we can also, we all have choices, I guess, about what we fund and how we fund. So by choosing to invest in systemic change in our housing system, we have the chance to really reimagine and support a new system that's inherently just and underscores the values of equity, inclusion, and shared prosperity. So some examples of like what we could fund are things like Amanda said, and others on the call too, policy, advocacy, and organizing. So when FHO started, we were funding national advocacy efforts to defend the HUD budget, for example. And we shifted our funding by listening to what folks in the field were saying, that there was a real problem in this kind of landlord-tenant power imbalance. And so we started to fund more local and statewide efforts around tenant protections. And we've seen a lot of success in that. And that was something that a lot of folks weren't funding 5 years ago. We also fund work on narrative change. So shifting the narrative so people stop thinking about housing as just a commodity and really about something that's necessary for everyone. It's part of our what we deserve because we are human. And also shifting the idea of homelessness away from the idea of deservedness, that, because we all deserve dignified housing, that homelessness is not the result of a personal failing, but it's really the failure of multiple systems, and that there are compassionate solutions that work. So funding work on narrative change. And there are some groups like the Housing Narrative Lab, Invisible People. There are groups that work nationally that can be supportive of local efforts as well and help people or organizations use their findings in their campaigns to get more people to understand these productive messages about housing. Another thing that we're funding, or we will be funding soon, is a table where continuums of care can meet and talk about how they want to redesign aspects of their homelessness response system with people with recent lived experience of homelessness in decision-making power. So that's something that we're trying to support and build, but it's one way where local government and nonprofits and others in the community are able to come together and try and figure out how that can work. But so that's kind of things you could fund, but also we need to think about how we fund. So supporting BIPOC-led organizations is really important. And along with that, thinking differently about risk. So for example, if BIPOC-led organizations haven't enjoyed the level of support as their white-led counterparts, why would we expect their balance sheets to look the same? I think we have to fundamentally rethink how we evaluate risk. And then recognize and interrupt white dominant culture in our own work. So, we are starting to move to conversations instead of written interim grant reports, supporting bottom-up approaches instead of our top-down theory of change, listening to the community when they tell you what's important, lessening the burden of the grant applications. All of that, I think, goes a long way to support the type of organizations that are really making headway when we think about housing justice. So that's what I would say about the funding piece. And I think Amanda really covered and our other speakers covered beyond the check, how we support with our convening power and so on. So I think I'm turning this over now for questions. Len, is that right?
You are. Thank you so much, Jeannie. And we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So please feel free, if anything surfaced for you, to drop your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your viewer. And I'll get things started off. Again, I'm Len Bartel, VP for Learning and Impact at CFLeads. I focus on capacity building and lead our individual learning and leadership programming opportunities. Something that stood out to me, both Amanda and Jeannie, you just brought it up, surfaced it again. Jeannie, you grounded us in language of fairness, inclusion. Amanda, in the frame of housing is justice, and I really love the trio of agency, power, and choice. And then Jennifer, you followed that with centering the leadership of individuals with lived experience in the work. And I'm wondering if, I guess first Jennifer and Charla, but then Amanda and Jeannie, please jump in. Can you share how you practice that community-driven strategy for your housing work? You kind of danced around the edges, but I'd love to dig down a little bit. Amanda, you had brought in, honoring their time with resources and supporting their engagement in the process. But what has that looked like for you, Jennifer in DC and Charlotte in Muscatine?
So I can start first, and I'll use the example of budget advocacy just because it's fresh in my head since we're just coming to the end of that. So we work with 7 organizations that are, some of them are made up of, founded by, led by, made up of people exclusively with lived experience of homelessness. And then some of them work with service conveners to identify priorities. And so we provide our grants to them each year. And then we take the priorities. We're lucky that we have a organization that convenes community members as well as the other organizations kind of working in various spaces to create a central budget platform across housing, health, safety, some other issue areas, so that we're not, all going to our elected officials and competing for resources, but it's really informed by, led by community members and people with lived experience across the various issue areas. And so we take that budget platform each year, and we bring our private sector leaders to the table to advocate around those priorities. So there are developers that come to the table with us, there's local philanthropy that comes with us, healthcare representatives, and other sectors that are all coming and saying, we are supporting these asks that are identified by our partners with lived experience, because they are best positioned to identify where the resources are needed and what solutions we should be investing in. And then we are also making those same asks and supporting those same priorities.
I think a simple one to show just on how we engage voices within our community is the neighborhood revitalization project, because at the base and core of those decisions that we're making is we've engaged the neighborhood to ensure that we're directing our decisioning. I mean, obviously we've got restrictions around some of our funding, that different funding lines that we have, but wherever we have the opportunity, we're trying to make sure that we drive and direct that through the folks that are currently living in this space, right? So that we make sure that we honor that and accommodate in a way that makes the most sense for their perspectives. And again, back to what Jennifer said, all of our we go across the sectors, as I kind of indicated. I don't think I did a great job, but in all our work, because we're trying to work collaboratively around everything we do. And many of our agencies in the sectors are working one-on-one with individuals and grabbing the voices of that and bringing those forward to the meetings and conversations we have, if we don't have folks that we're absolutely currently serving sitting at the table. In some of our roles, we require that, and some of our organizations that we work directly with, we require that. We have lived experience on our board and our team as well, but those are important components, or else we may be making decisions that are going to harm versus create additional success for folks that are working alongside.
So are they part of the decision-making process at some point, whether it's investment decisions of where to invest the community foundation's money? And
yes, and that's another great, on all our funding, all of our granting by application, we have community, we have diverse, different groups of community members coming together to make those recommendations back to our board of directors. So our staff's not engaged in that, but we take our community voices and take direction from them.
Amanda or Jeannie, is there anything that comes to mind for you and your kind of perch, your point of view across the sector around examples that you would lift up around kind of engaging resident voice in housing coalitions and processes?
So Funders Together to End Homelessness is a member of the National Coalition for Housing Justice. We were one of the founders. It involves about 10 national groups that work on policy and capacity at the national level and also at the community level. About a year ago, we have had people with lived experience as a part of that coalition because they are leading organizations and do have lived expertise. But we made an intentional shift to have more members with lived experience not associated with an organization to be a part of a newly formed steering committee and shift the power dynamics of that coalition. I can tell you it's been a learning journey, a challenge worth every second, because we are doing what we preach and practicing that, shifting that power dynamics. People are, as I always say, not coming to the table with a folding chair, but a permanent chair, and actually then making their own circles of influence outside of the table that we've already set for them. And so that's one tangible way. But philanthropy needed to support that in terms of paying for their time, getting them resource to learn about all the jargon that a lot of policy groups use. There's often disruption that is meant as good intent, and we sometimes have to have facilitated dialogues around that. So there is some resource intentionality that happens with having people with lived expertise. But it's shown a major shift in some of the policy work we've done nationally and within communities.
Great, thank you. Jeannie?
For us, an example would be we're creating a community of advisors, which are people who are not like executive directors of the funded organizations that we interact with, but people are kind of next level leaders who are looking for opportunities to accelerate their leadership development. And preferably these would be people with lived experience of housing instability and or homelessness. And the role they would play for us is as advisors and strategic points of when we're shifting our direction. I don't think our members are all ready to cede grant making decision authority to folks yet, but we're inching closer maybe. But this is a way for folks to gain some exposure to philanthropy if they have an interest in it. And then in return, we will create kind of like not a support group, but like a group for them to really talk with a facilitator about how they want to grow professionally as well, and then support whatever that looks like. If they want executive coaching, if they want to have, particular speaker come in and talk to them, like it really will be driven by their desires and what they hope for in ways that they believe can accelerate their leadership development. So that's something that we're developing right now. We'll be kicking that off probably in the next 3 or 4 months, and expect growing pains as well.
Thank you for sharing. We do have a few questions that came into the Q&A box. First, and I had this on my list as well, I used to be in the health conversion funding space. And Samantha Smith is wondering what strategies have been fruitful in getting local healthcare institutions involved in this conversation. She's currently experiencing hesitation around data sharing, but want to explore collaboration past that topic. So Jennifer or Charlotte, within your work, have you engaged healthcare institutions? And Carla, specifically, you mentioned data in your presentation around illuminating the variety of impact of housing in your community. So just wondering of your experiences engaging healthcare in this and data sharing.
So we partner very closely with the local healthcare agencies. And so they are one of our collaborative partners in all our decisioning. As far as them providing specific funding to the housing efforts, we actually see them working alongside us to do additional dollars to support healthcare efforts in the community, that outreach, things like that, to the downstream outcomes. So we haven't necessarily moved them to upstream engagement with house building, but they have really been beneficial in making sure, like we have a wellness clinic in the homeless shelter that's open to everybody that can come, but also for the folks that are most in need. So we've seen them engage in a lot of different ways, and they're at the table on almost all our community decisioning strategies.
And was that because of historic relationship that folks had, or what made that relationship possible between the healthcare system and the housing coalition or conversation?
Again, we're a rural community, so
Yeah.
we all cross paths more often. So I would say that consistently that they've been at the table throughout our history in our community and county.
Okay. Jennifer, are you guys engaging healthcare institutions?
We are, and we actually just added several new healthcare institutions to our leadership council this year. So I think we hope there will be more in the future, and we're trying to figure out what that looks like. But I would say a place to start is just to ask, right? Like we reached out and we said, we recognize there's this overlap. You all are doing work. Several of them were already working around housing and doing work around housing. And we said, do you want to join our table? And they all enthusiastically said yes. So I think we have some work to do to figure out how we can better work together and align some of our efforts, but they are around the table as of this year. And so we're excited to see where that takes us.
Great, thank you. Brittany Merritt is asking, really, how do we get started, right? These are huge systems and issues, right? Housing, education, she mentioned housing and transportation. And I'm sure funders on this call, community foundations, are different places on that spectrum, from just getting started to going really deep and kind of expansive coalition that you have laid out, Jennifer and Charla. How would you recommend they get started? Where did you guys seed your initial interest? Was it convening a conversation because you knew this issue was important? And did it start from a grant making perspective? Just wondering how you all got engaged with it.
Yeah, I think any opportunity, they should just seize it, and it will lead to more, right? I mean, that's really where we were strategic once we built interest, but a big part of being able to seize the opportunities, educating whoever your leadership partners are so they can understand why you should be in that space. So a lot of salesmanship. And then the first opportunity that the door opens, I'd be engaging in it so that you kind of mark your territory that you're headed this direction, and then things will unfold. I mean, the opportunities will unfold in front of them, and that's what we've seen in this area and some others work in. Jeff?
I think one of the things that kickstarted our more deeper engagement was the housing security study. And I'm not suggesting that everyone needs a housing security study. A lot of that data is out there. But having those numbers and those recommendations were how the foundation started going out and having some of those conversations and engaging new partners. And then once the idea of the partnership was kind of came together between the community foundation and DC government, then we went on a pretty extensive listening tour and talking to people who had experienced homelessness, people who are working in the sector at various levels, people who had funded in the area, donors who were interested in the work, because we knew that that would be an important part of bringing them to the table. But I think that listening tour was really important. And it is also, we've done it a few times now around different topics. So when we decided to start making advocacy grants, we did another listening tour, specifically going out and asking people on the ground, more of the grassroots organizations, who's doing this work, who should we be funding, who should we be partnering with? And that's how we identified partners. So like Spin said, take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. But I think just starting to have conversations and listening as much as possible is also a great place to start.
And the other thing I'd add is depending on how drastic of steps you're taking, you need a leadership board that is in a position to take risk, right? Because people are going to question why you've entered the space, or is it necessary, or something may not go the way you expect. And there's some people along your route that will not be able to tolerate that, and they're going to stand in your way. So you've got to find a way to bring the others along and limit that voice a little bit if you really feel like that's the direction you're headed. But we were lucky. We had as we transitioned, we built a board that could take risks.
Amanda and Jeannie, from your situation, where you're situated in the ecosystem with the many funders that you work with, where have you seen folks get started? I'm sure you've got, the broad spectrum of folks who are engaged in this work, some who are been doing this for quite some time and others who are just kind of getting started. What have you seen as successful kind of first steps for funders, for community foundations specifically, but kind of funders more broadly?
I mean, I don't know that I have anything different than what's already been said. I think where we see most success is people listening, like starting that and developing relationships. And then once the trust is built, trying to figure out what they can do together. And that takes careful facilitation, and it takes time, and it takes attention to caring about people as individuals, all up and down that relationship. So just want to underscore, I think that's both what Charlotte and Jennifer were saying too, that's listening and developing relationships. Yep. And from there, jumping off.
Thank you. Anything different, Amanda? Just a lot of nodding and
Yeah, same. And I think in many of the examples, it's sometimes you, unfortunately, like the pandemic or a crisis can often offer opportunity for people to come together and convene, and you can, use that as a nucleus, get some strong strategic partners to even have an all-day learning session, a tour of other communities, and seeing what they're doing. So think of maybe a convening event that can serve as that jump off or kickoff, that can help people learn and broaden their expertise. We've helped many local communities conduct those tours around the country. I'm happy to talk to you about how that we can help get that started.
Thank you.
And I'll just ditto that. I was going to say, join Funders Together because there are countless examples of foundations from every kind of geographic area, every different types of communities. That you're going to find someone that you can relate to and their experience that you can relate to and that you can learn from. And you'll hear things you never thought of that is the best idea ever. And then you can come back to your community and, sound like a really intelligent person.
Genius.
Glenn, I want to add one other thing. I think everything does take time, but we really got to put our foot on the gas, right? Like that's our job as community foundations, because we've got children that are homeless and living in situations they shouldn't live in, and adults that are homeless and live in situations they shouldn't live in. And so our work, we have to be able to sell that impatience alongside the work that we want to achieve as we gather that, as we process through that. So I think that's the other thing that that was my point of like start, right? We've got to start. But I think that's a big piece of our salesmanship with our constituents and whoever we're coming in contact with, is that lack of patience.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one last or two if we're quick. Jennifer and Charlotte, you both really detailed really well the variety of roles that community foundations can play, right? As funders, the way you've engaged with research and data, as conveners, as entities that have launched their own initiatives, and also working with advisors and donors who give through your foundation for this work. But you also both lifted up your partnerships with government, and I'm wondering if you could speak to how that has evolved over time, and how long, similar to kind of working with healthcare institutions, how long did it take to build that trust and relationship with local government to become more kind of connected, synergistic partners in the work?
So we're 5 years into the partnership, and the Community Foundation was partnering with the Interagency Council on Homelessness staff person before that. That position transitioned. There was a new staff person that came in during the pandemic. And so I would say we have been doing this for over 5 years and been working together pretty closely in conversation. And there are times when it feels like, we are like doing it. We're working together, we're working in the same direction. We understand one another. We have the same goals. And then there are times where it's like, wait, what is happening? Like, what happened? So it definitely takes time. And unfortunately, turnover makes you have to in some ways start over, which is also a challenge. But I think Amanda said earlier, or someone said that it's been worth every second. It's worth it in the end, because we have been able to do things we couldn't do on our own, and really have a bigger impact. But the relationship is hard, and it definitely takes time. And sometimes it takes a reset and more conversation to make sure we're working in the same direction.
I was fortunate when I was at the homeless shelter to build a really strong relationship with some folks at the city that we've been able to grow even further. And then we brought the county alongside in many of the conversations. And again, it's easier once you have a good idea to hold on to that collaboratively than it is hierarchically, because hierarchically somebody can stop it, but collaboratively there's the group's pushing it forward. And so once you bring those sectors together and build some trust, you're all there for the right reasons. But we see the same thing once in a while. We're like, whoa, like this should have been simpler to get where we're going. But I think time and relationships and having a clear focus where we're headed just continues to help us in our community.
Great. Amanda or Jeannie, quickly, are there any examples you would lift up around community foundations partnering with government?
I put some stuff in the chat. I think
Oh,
I
great. Yep.
to mention like the really important partnership at the federal level as well as the local level. And so, you know, through this engagement with HUD, through our partnership with the United Interagency Council on Homelessness, we've been able to uncover ideas where we can think about public-private partnerships for innovations, maybe for small pilots or large scale things. I know many of our members have seeded resources to help have people with lived experience engage at the federal level in offices such as the United Interagency Council on Homelessness. And so those are all roles that we can all play in partnership with our federal government.
Jeannie, if you don't have anything else to add, I think it's my turn now to turn it back to Rachel to close us out.
Thanks, Len, and thank you, everyone. That was a great conversation. So yeah, we just want to extend a huge thank you again to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, our incredible field partners, and of course, these amazing community foundations that have been featured all throughout this webinar series. And just again, we will be sending out consolidated tools and resources in the coming days, so stay tuned for that. Mia, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, we just echo our thanks and appreciation for CFLeads for this partnership and to all of the speakers for all of the webinar series. And as Rachel indicated, we'll be sending out links so that you can stay in touch. It's the end of the series, but it's just the beginning for more champions for housing. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.